Hi, welcome to the 20th session of Questioning the Present, an online forum jointly sponsored by Center for Global Culture and Communication at Northwestern University and Center for Transcultural Studies, which is an independent virtual scholarly network. I'm Dilip Gaukar. I direct both of these centers. Today's session will profile Professor Robert Pippin's recent book, The Culmination, which scholar respondents, Professor Peter Gordon, Andreja Novakovic, and Mark Alzenau. I will introduce all four of our distinguished panelists shortly. Before that, let me state the protocols governing the online Zoom session. Our webmaster is Vidura Bahadur on the left corner, depending on how your computer is configured. A graduate student associate of CGCC, he will handle the web. This session is recorded for archival purposes and will be released to the public in a day or two upon securing the permission of our four scholars assembled here today. Session will unfold as follows. After my quick introduction of all four of our scholars, the Professor Pippin will introduce his book, The Culmination, for about 20 to 25 minutes, followed by the three respondents, Professor Gordon, Novakovic, and Alzenau, in that order. Each respondent will have 12 minutes to deliver their comments, followed by a response by Professor Pippin to his respondents for about 10 minutes. After his response, we will start a question and answer session, beginning with a quick comments by the three respondents. As for the question and answer session, please either raise your hand by using the reaction function on your screen or send message to Vidura indicating that you wish to ask a question by using the chat function. You may also write the question in the chat for Vidura to read the audience and to the relevant panelists. That covers everything as far as the protocols are concerned. Now the introductions, which I will keep to minimum. Professor Robert Pippin is the Evelyn Stephenson Neff Distinguished Service Professor in the Committee on Social Thought and the Department of Philosophy at the University of Chicago. He is the author of several books and articles on German idealism and later German philosophy, including Kant's Theory of Form, Hegel's Idealism, Modernism as a Philosophical Problem, Idealism as Modernism. In addition, he has published on issues in political philosophy, theories of self-consciousness, the nature of conceptual change, and problem of freedom. He has also written extensively on the philosophical issues and concerns that emerge and are addressed in art, literature, and film. He wrote in 2000 a book on Henry James called Henry James and Modern Moral Life. And 21 years later, he published a book on metaphysical exile on the South African writer J.M. Coteje's Jesus Fictions. He has also written 5 books, and it turns out he's on to the 6th book on film. My favorite among those 5 books, 6th one I haven't looked at it yet, is Fatalism in American Film Noir, Some Cinematic Philosophy. His broadly humanistic work has earned him many awards and recognitions. He is a winner of the Mellon Distinguished Achievement Award in Humanities. He has the rare distinction of holding the Alexander Humboldt Fellowship twice, and he has been a fellow also at Wissenschaft College in Berlin. He is a fellow of American Academy of Arts and Science and a member of American Philosophical Society. He is also a member of German National Academy of Arts and Science. With that, I move on to our first distinguished respondent, Peter E. Gordon. He's a Amabel B. James Professor of History at Harvard University. He's also a faculty fellow in the Department of Philosophy and Department of Germanic Languages and Literature. Primarily a scholar of modern European social theory, he works chiefly on the theme in continental philosophy and social thought in Germany and France in the late modern era, with an emphasis on critical theory, Western Marxism, the Frankfurt School, Hegelianism, and related topics in phenomenology and existentialism. His first book, Rosenzweig and Heidegger, Between Judaism and German Philosophy, published in 2003, has received 4 international awards. Unfortunately, I can't identify all of them due to time limitation. The second book, Continental Divide, Heidegger, Cassirer, and Devos, received Jacques Barzun Prize from American Philosophical Society. And he wrote a third book, Adorno and Existence, in 2016, published by Harvard University Press. He has edited numerous collections, including Cambridge Companion to Modern Jewish Philosophy, Modernist Imagination, Essays in Intellectual History and Critical Theory, Weimar Thought, A Contested Legacy, and The Trace of God, Derrida and Religion. And there are numerous co-authored and co-edited volumes, simply too many for me to identify at this point in time. Finally, Peter delivered the Distinguished Adorno Lecture at the Institute for Social Research at Goethe Institute in 2019, and his most recent book, related probably to that lecture, is A Precarious Happiness, Adorno and the Sources of Normativity, published in 2023. I'm pleased to announce that this book will be profiled on this forum in this coming fall, 2025. He's currently finishing a biography of Walter Benjamin, and he's also writing a longer critical study on secularization and social theory since Max Weber. The second respondent is Andreja Novakovic. Is a professor in philosophy at UC Berkeley, and she's affiliated with the program in critical theory. Her research interests are in the 19th and 20th century European philosophy with a focus on Hegel. She is the author of Hegel and the Second Nature in Ethical Life, published in 2017, and has also published several important essays on Hegel's anthropology, philosophy of history, and social and political philosophy. She's currently working on a book about social experience in Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, as well as another book on Hegel's conception of the family. And like Professor Pippin, she's interested in film, and she's writing a book on, or finished a book, which is about to be published, on filmmaker Chantal Ackerman. Finally, the third respondent is my colleague, Mark Alzenau, specializes in the 19th century philosophy, especially the work of Hegel. His interests include history of metaphysics, practical philosophy, social theory, and aesthetics. He is the author of Hegel's Theory of Responsibility, and he has recently published a second project on Hegel's encyclopedia system, tentatively entitled Hegel's Sole Idea. Among his current projects are essays on the pragmatist critique of rationalism, on Weber's notion of value freedom, and on the legacy of historical materialism. That brings to an end my introduction, and now I recede in the background and hand the floor over to Professor Robert Pippin. Here you go.
Thank you very much, Philip. And it goes without saying that I'm extremely grateful that you and the center organized this, and that I'm even more grateful to the time spent by our distinguished panel in reading the book, and I look forward very much to their comments. I think the easiest way for me to offer some points of summary, obviously in limited time, it's going to be pretty truncated, but I want to concentrate on 3 things in particular. One is the interpretation of Heidegger, which I have experienced in the last year, is quite controversial, especially with respect to the issue of the continuity or discontinuity in Heidegger's thought. Secondly, the basic charge against Hegel, which I assume, which has already drawn the most attention. I thought the sections on Kant were pretty good, but concentration in the critical response has been on Hegel, probably understandably. And then the kind of Heideggerian alternative, what I call at the end of the book, well, a new form of philosophy, which Heidegger calls poetic thinking, which would be adequate to the kind of revolution in our self-understanding that he first began proposing in Being and Time. So the first question, the interpretation, and this is easy enough to start because everybody knows Heidegger says there's only one question in philosophy. What is the meaning of being? It was starting in the 1920s in Marburg and extending through the first masterpiece, 1927, Being in Time. I take my bearings from a claim in that book that I argue is consistent throughout the various reformulations of Heidegger's position in his later career. And it's the claim in Being in Time that significance, Bedeutsamkeit, is that on the basis of which the world is disclosed as such. So I take him to mean that the problem of the meaning of being is the problem of the meaningfulness of being, given that emphasis on Bedeutsamkeit. That is, beings in the way they originally matter in our experience. Their way of mattering, according to Heidegger, is their original way of being available in experience. They become salient, as he says, primordially, first of all, in a familiarity permeated by degrees of significance, something itself derivative from the epochal world into which we are thrown, simply how beings originally show up in our experience. The source of that salience is the meaningfulness of being qua being. This is actually a dual question for Heidegger. It involves first or second in his career, didn't finish the project in Being in Time, the history of being, his account of epochal worlds like the Greek world, the Judeo-Christian world, the early modern world, the late modern world, the technological and framing. But second, it also involves some sort of reflection on the possibility of meaningfulness as such. The possibility of meaningfulness question is not a transcendental condition question for Heidegger because it can't be raised in strict distinction from the meaningfulness of beings and the problem of interpretation. The difference between the two issues is what Heidegger calls the ontological difference, and what animates his critique of Western metaphysics is such a confusion between the determinate availability of the beings that matter with the availability of mattering as such, being qua being in any possible availability. And our way of being on to this significance issue is not for Heidegger a matter of the application of concepts of mattering or any kind of discursive formulability that precedes or in some way must accompany our original way of experiencing things that matter. It's what he calls Stimmung or attunement. And this attunement is not any result of a subjective imposition, as if we first encounter objects in their perceptual properties and then impose or bring to the experience a subjective notion of significance which we impose. In Heidegger's way of thinking, Dasein is his word for human being, is by and large subject to a regime of worldly significance, not the subject of it. It makes no sense phenomenologically to think that we first experience objects in their perceptual properties and then in our minds, as it were, experience them as significant. That makes no more sense to him than that we hear sounds first and then experience them in our mind as words. It's Heidegger's claim about primordiality and fundamentality. That's crucial. That any awareness of such an original attunement has been lost or forgotten is how Heidegger wants to characterize what he calls, especially in the Hölderlin lectures, our destitute time, a time of homelessness, or even in his nature lectures, nihilism. The meaning of being has been assumed to be the mere perceivable presence of beings, what he calls ständige Anwesenheit, or a kind of barely meaningful form of discursive intelligibility, substances perduring in time that are detectable, we take to be what it is to be. That is, there is a mode of assumed availability that obscures, blocks us from understanding our own experience, the original availability of beings in their mattering in historical time. And this is the paradox that Heidegger in Being in Time welcomes, that what is in fact closest to us has now become farthest from us in its fundamental availability. This also speaks in a way to the critical potential of Heidegger's approach. What he wants to claim about the ultimate, if not existential, groundlessness of this metaphysical orientation has a normative consequence that Heidegger clearly thinks is catastrophic, a dimension brought out best, attuned to Heidegger, by such Heideggerians as the early Marcuse on one-dimensionality and Hannah Arendt on what she calls thoughtlessness, or even Leo Strauss's critique of modernity, which shares elements of Heidegger. All were students of Heidegger in Marburg and Freiburg. And it also manifests itself in Heidegger's not infrequent links of consumer capitalism and modern scientism, with the implications of the metaphysics of presence, which he thinks have sort of downstream effects in modern culture that can be traced back to the forgetting of the question of the meaning of being. Now, given our usual assumptions about the basic steering mechanisms of society, the form of economic structure, sale of wage labor, the creation of surplus capital, and the political organization of society, and even now the influence of social media, we wouldn't think that the basic steering mechanism should be traced back to fundamentality of the meaning of being. But Heidegger's point, actually, I think is quite credible, that we don't really have a good understanding of why these forms of life, these basic elements of the late modern form of life, have the grip on us they do. Since most of us actually are dissatisfied with the fundamental form of life in which we live. We think it's crudely materialist, secularist, consumerist, and so forth, in a way that obscures fundamental elements of our experience that we seem to think of as merely subjective now. But anyway, the fact that Heidegger thinks all of this descends in some way from an original orientation of metaphysics that started with Plato can seem very plausible to people. But I think it does have something to say for us. Well, given this understanding of the problem, what's rightly be called, another way, the logical prejudice of Western metaphysics, which means what there is what could be the fit subject of an assertoric judgment, that the primacy of discursive intelligibility is assumed. What's the problem with Hegel and German idealism? Well, first, something about the idealism in German idealism, also perhaps for some controversial kind of claim, but I think it's Heidegger's understanding, shouldn't be understood as a claim about the mind dependence of the world, or about mind-imposed structure, or the so-called objective idealism, the non-material or mental or noetic nature of the real. But first and foremost, idealism in the German tradition is an objection to empiricism, the claim that all knowledge is or must be based on empirical experience. By contrast, idealism in Kant, Fichte, early Schelling, and Hegel is a claim about the capacity of pure, unaided human reason to determine of all that is knowable, that it is knowable, and how it is knowable. Since this amounts to a claim about the normative authority of knowledge claims, undergirded by pure reason's enterprise, and since it is pure reason alone that demonstrates such normative authority, this must mean that human reason is to be understood in this tradition as self-authorized, tribunal unto itself. And Heidegger notes in his Kant book, this idealist move results in a paradoxical self-reflection, what he calls a philosophical laying of the ground of philosophy. Heidegger is echoing the Kantian claim that in pure critique, to quote Kant, we are dealing with what reason brings forth entirely out of itself. In the Hegelian version, that'll ultimately be the main focus, or is the main focus in the book. The determination of the knowable should be understood as a determination of all that there is and its knowability. And so a metaphysics, because the claim is all that there is what is knowable, Kant on the thing in itself, not in what playing the role it does in Heidegger's interpretation that it does in others. Especially true of Hegel. The determination of the knowable is not for Hegel the determination of a limitation, as if a limitation is just the knowable for us. This self-determination by reason of its own requirements is, according to Hegel, as in his famous phrase, absolute. And so a determination of the absolute of all that is finally articulated knowably, and that leaves nothing out. Reason's self-imposed requirements define and delimit all that there is and can be. In other words, idealism invokes the deepest principle of Western rationalism that began with Plato. To be is to be rationally intelligible. There can be nothing alogos or unintelligible. The famous phrase in German idealism is the identity, speculative identity of thinking and being. That's the way I think idealism understands that phrase. Not that all that is being is really thought or something like that. If we put this in Heideggerian terms, the claim will be that the immediate familiar availability of beings is a consequence of our experiencing, we can even say caring about them, their mattering. As for the tradition, conceptually knowable, that's what counts. That is, this is assumed what matters most in our lives. The unique modality of our being, of our care, is such discursive knowability. The world that matters to us is available because of our explanatory and conceptual capacities. And this is the founding picture of Greek metaphysics, what we most need in a reconciled life, with a feeling of being at home in the world we find ourselves thrown into. Our way of understanding its fundamental intelligibility is a way of reconciling ourselves with it, culminating in Hegel. It's a kind of banal expression of the unusual Greek idea that the cosmos is good. It makes itself available to us fully, not in a way that we'll ever complete, but fully in its potential explicability. Well, there are two main lines of criticism of Hegel, only one of which I'll be able to discuss. And I apologize for the jargon, but to get into Hegel, you have to appreciate that his basic claim is that the absolute, the fundamental meaning of being, is the concept, the absolute idea. Or that the science of being qua being is, as he says it is in the logic, the science of pure thinking, not a claim which he insists on that I think has been appreciated in most interpretations of the logic. The other problem, which we won't have time in, locates Hegel within the problem of modern subjectivism or subjectivity, but here I'll take up only the first. Heidegger's critique of the logic was partly an attempt to explain why he thinks that project, which for many reasons, many readers is as baffling as there is in philosophy, actually represents the core of the rationalist enterprise in philosophy and shows us its culmination. Where culmination doesn't mean come to fruition, but come to a dead end. Nothing more to be done. To understand what Heidegger means, we should recall that the essential activity in this tradition of rendering anything intelligible, any Sein or being in Heidegger's terminology, has been since Aristotle predication. I note the claim in the book by Arya Kozman that for Aristotle, and I claim also for Hegel, predication is the face of being. A perfect opening for Heidegger because it's precisely what Heidegger means by too central a role of logic, the science of predication in Western metaphysics. It's not as if there's no attention to the question of the ordinary meaningfulness or originary meaningfulness of being in Hegel, but it remains, according to Heidegger, unthought as such, simply assumed, and this for a simple reason. Hegel simply assumed that there's an unavoidable matter of fundamental meaningfulness in the very possibility of Geist or spirit, human being what it is, freedom and the realization of freedom. What matters in a human life, what must matter, such that being ignored comes to cropper in some way, allows us not to pursue in any coherence the enterprise we are pursuing. What must matter in our engagements with the world and with others is the realization of freedom, a state of self-knowledge as a free being, and its actuality in what he called being with self in another, ultimately in the rational structure of ethical life. The absence of such a realization matters especially when its realization is denied or simply incomplete. Its effective denial or absence, the denial or absence of recognition of this conatus in all human life, can be shown to result in the self-negation of any model of knowing or any practical project embodying that absence or incompleteness. Just as the incomplete concept of a fully self-conscious account of the logical intelligibility of being negates itself determinately. This is the way he tries to demonstrate, Hegel, that nothing matters if the telos of freedom does not matter, even if its ultimately mattering is not consciously available fully to Geist at a time. The very first moment of the phenomenology manifests this sort of claim. The idealized first subject of the phenomenology assumes the world is available to us simply by virtue of its sensible presence. One is immediately onto a sensed object, supposedly just by directly sensing them, but any distinctly human form of apprehension, and here the Hegelian assumption emerges that Heidegger is interested in, must be able to say what it knows. Otherwise, it is just differentially responsive and not an instance of conscious knowing. What matters, and it matters a priori for Hegel, is whether we can say what we know, and Heidegger is right to challenge this assumed orectic relation to the world, that's what emerges in significance as the most fundamental or salient in our experience. The absence of such saying would be untrue to the experience nature of a human knower as such, and in that sense, it would be an instance of unfreedom. It puts itself unavoidably to the test by trying to say what it knows and failing. This is the first manifestation of the conatus of freedom, being who one is, eventually to involve being with self in an other. As we've seen Heidegger argue, Hegel can demonstrate this, to use Heidegger's language, because he's already assumed the absolute in phenomenological terms, this ultimately of the conatus from the beginning. And that means that metaphysics as unconditioned thinking on thinking is an illusion, question begging because of this assumption. So given this interpretation of idealism and given Heidegger's fundamental claim about the originary or primordiality of this availability as meaningfulness through a kind of non-discursive orientation, a sensing of its significance through what he calls Stimmung, Hegel's enterprise, as you can see in the phenomenology, is much more consistent with the traditional post-Platonic rational enterprise, only differing from it in this historical notion of developmental self-consciousness and in the final articulation of what's going on in the developmental self-consciousness in the science of logic, none of which for Heidegger addresses the question of the original possibility of the meaningfulness of being, simply assumes that its discursive intelligibility is the fundamental object of concern in an uncertain, anxiety-producing world in which we wish to understand and eventually to control, after Descartes, and master the environment around us in its intelligibility, which will eventually lead to the world of technology. I don't want to talk for too long, so let me turn to the most controversial issue. If it is not, if Heidegger thinks we've forgotten the ability to orient ourselves originally from, engage with, question, interrogate this fundamental level of Bedeutsamkeit or significance or mattering in modern mass societies, leading to a kind of conformism and technification of everyday life, thoughtless scientism, and so forth. This is Heidegger's explanation for these phenomena. What is the alternative? Well, their claim in the book, and I'll sort of end with these remarks, the claim in the book, we could talk long enough, is that there's something to Heidegger's encouraging us to think of the fundamental task of philosophy, not as analytic, not certainly as restricted to the analysis of concepts, the attempt to state the necessary and sufficient conditions for the meaningful content of content, was still pretty much the core of not just Anglophone, but in increasingly most philosophy in the world, but interpretive. Interpretive in the sense in which Heidegger defines it originally in Being and Time and extends it throughout his history of being. But interpretive means not a kind of paraphrase of mattering into discursive form. That would be inconsistent with, or at least partly inconsistent with, his enterprise. So the question most people have about Heidegger is if the disclosure of being in an original mode of availability isn't discursive predicative, isn't formulable in discursive form, what is it that's disclosed? The most famous criticism of Heidegger on this story is Ernst Tugendhat's long ago, that if something is disclosed and we can't say what it is, its truth conditions don't even apply. We could say anything we want. I mean, this is like the famous response to Wittgenstein's claim that that of which we cannot speak, we should stay silent. And the response is, if you can't say it, you can't say it, and you can't whistle it either. So the objection to Heidegger is that he leaves us with a kind of swarm of indeterminacy. But in a way, if you just think about both everyday life and things like the interpretation of literary works or cinematic works, we function with a kind of indeterminacy, a refusal in a way to formulate things that have explicit bivalent truth conditions. Whenever we try to understand what somebody means by saying that, what they mean by not showing up, what this collective decision really meant, given that its official proclamation of itself is not convincing. And the same thing with literary texts, where the idea of paraphrasing something like the meaning of the text, understanding what it is to experience the text in discursive formulations always seems banal and reductionist. And then what do we do in interpretive activity? Well, Heidegger's phrase is something like very often hinweisen, we point in a way. If you're thinking of teaching to students, for example, it's a matter of uh, articulating elements in your experience of the poem that will help them re-experience the poem in perhaps a deeper other way, not in terms of a kind of conceptually guided interpretive journey through the poem, but to awaken, Heidegger's favorite word, a sense of significance that we would not otherwise have appreciated. That can't be done discursively by paraphrase. So I think there is something, and it has to do with work on literature and film, that I think is essential to philosophy. Life is lived first personally, and philosophy doesn't have much access to the kind of first personal dimensions of life that Kant, with his thesis about the priority of practical reason, put on the agenda for philosophy in a very limited way, but it opened up a way of articulating the autonomy of the personal point of view, the first personal point of view, what it's like for me to confront an action or a problem or a dilemma or a crisis or something like that, that Heidegger reanimated with what became first a kind of a whole popular series of existentialist books by others, but which Heidegger always rejected, since his main problem is this question of the fundamentality in philosophy of the meaningfulness of being, the fact that it's not discursively available, and therefore the need for philosophy to find different ways of re-articulating what could be disclosed for us now as Bedeutsamkeit, significance. I think I'll stop there rather than prattle on, because I'm very interested in hearing what others have to say.
Thank you, Robert. Okay, now we move on to Professor Peter Gordon.
Thanks so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me begin by saying it's a pleasure to engage in this conversation with Robert Pippin. Although I came to know him personally only a few years ago, I've been learning from him for a long time, from his study of Hegel's idealism to works such as Modernity as a Philosophical Problem and After the Beautiful. His most recent book, The Culmination, strikes a strong chord with me, both personally and intellectually, and I read it with real excitement. In my very brief time today, I'll take up three themes that stand out for me. They're braided together, as I'll try to explain, and they are Heidegger's concept of idealism, Heidegger's theory of meaning, and Heidegger's cultural politics. So first, I'll address the question of idealism. In section 43 of Being and Time, in the well-known discussion of idealism and realism, Heidegger aligns himself with idealism, at least as a matter of general orientation. He writes, as compared with realism, idealism, no matter how contrary and untenable it may be in its result, has the advantage in principle. This is so, he explains, because, quote, idealism emphasizes that being and reality are only, in scare quotes, in the consciousness. Now, that's a striking claim. Note that Heidegger places the phrase in the consciousness between inverted commas as if to convey his distaste for the cognitivist subject it implies. He gives with one hand what he takes back with the other. Despite that ambivalence, he endorses idealism with good reason. He concludes this way: if what the term idealism says amounts to an understanding that being can never be explained by entities, but is already that which is transcendental for every entity, then idealism affords the only correct possibility for a philosophical problematic. Now, Pippin's, of course, familiar with this passage and the readings it's inspired. He even quotes this passage on page 161 of his book. Important works such as Heidegger's Temporal Idealism by Bill Blattner have argued, convincingly, I think, that Heidegger was not thoroughly opposed to idealism because he understood that it captures a basic truth. We do not confront a world as an array of present-at-hand objects without meaning. We encounter it as an environment, a context of significance and concern. But this context of Weltlichkeit, or worldhood, is conditional upon our own Seinsverständnis, our understanding of being. Absent this understanding, there might still be entities, of course, but they would not be disclosed. Dasein's understanding of being is therefore a kind of transcendental condition in the Kantian sense, and this is the gist of the passage I've just quoted. Now, of course, Heidegger doesn't wish to endorse the intellectualist and rationalistic prejudices that disfigure Kant's transcendental idealism. He thinks he has avoided those liabilities with the claim that Dasein is not a disengaged mind that confronts a world of appearance. It is instead an engaged and ongoing event. It finds itself caught up in the very practices by which the world is disclosed. But it follows that the disclosed world may not be mind dependent, but it is in a very deep sense Dasein dependent. In Basic Problems, Heidegger confirms that idealist insight. He writes, "The world is not the sum total of extant entities. It is quite generally not extant at all. It is a determination of being in the world, a moment in the structure of Dasein's mode of being. The world is, so to speak, Dasein-ish." It's an odd translation. It's Daseinsmäßig. And that's from Basic Problems 237 in the German. Heidegger's commitment to transcendentalism in this sense helps us to understand why his Kant book plays such an important role in his thinking. There he seeks to combat Kant's intellectualist prejudice by discerning in the A edition an insight into the primacy of the imagination over understanding. And this is an insight, Heidegger says, that caused Kant to draw back in fear. But even while Heidegger rejects the primacy of reason in transcendental idealism, he endorses idealism's basic thrust, namely that the disclosed world is conditional upon the meaning of being that belongs to Dasein's own interpretive manner of being in the world. So while I can appreciate the importance of Hegel in Heidegger's philosophical story, it seems to me that Hegel does not represent the culmination of idealism. That distinction may belong to Heidegger himself. This is not as controversial as it may sound. Heidegger's favorable remarks on idealism and being in time place him squarely in line with a tradition of thinking that stretches back to Plato and Parmenides, according to which the human being enjoys a special endowment of understanding without which the world would not appear at all. What makes the alliance with idealism somewhat hard to discern is chiefly Heidegger's externalism. Namely, he disavows the cognitivist prejudice that haunts the tradition of idealism when it inquires into the conditions of world disclosure. For Heidegger, those conditions are not mind-dependent. They are Dasein-dependent. But Dasein, and here's his externalism, is not primarily cognitive, it is practical. The meaning of being is therefore displaced. It's externalized from the mind and is dispersed into Dasein's own worldly dealings, its manifold ways of concern. Still, that externalism, I'd suggest, should not prevent us from acknowledging his enduring bond with the idealist insight that the world is meaningful only thanks to the beings to whom it is disclosed. In the jargon of phenomenology, we are, after all, the datives for whom phenomena appear at all. Following Gunther Anders and Theodor Adorno, it'd be tempting to conclude that Heidegger is a crypto-idealist. For all of the this-worldly pathos that governs his work, Dasein remains caught in the pseudo-concrete horizon of its own interpretive schemes. To repeat, I think this means that Heidegger may be mistaken to see in Hegel the culmination of metaphysics. Perhaps that ambivalent badge of honor belongs to Heidegger himself. And that brings me to my second point. There's admittedly something quite puzzling about this idealist strain in Heidegger, and the puzzle comes out most clearly when Pippin pursues his interpretation of Heidegger's philosophy as an inquiry into the Sinn des Seins, or the meaning of being. I fully agree with Pippin that this is Heidegger's quarry, and I admire the way in which Pippin has reconstructed it. But here's the difficulty, and I think Pippin actually just summarized the problem quite well. What does Heidegger mean by meaning? The more I've worked on Heidegger, the more I feel that he's failed to answer that question. Pippin wants to say that beneath all the errors and distortions of the philosophical tradition, we can discern and perhaps are always already in some sense alive to the meaning of being. This meaning, however, does not show up discursively. In fact, if we seek to characterize it by means of concepts, we only subject it to further distortion. The meaning of being is not available to us conceptually, or at least it is not at first available to us conceptually. Instead, we are responsive to it. We are receptive to it. We are immersed in it. We possess a pre-discursive familiarity with it, and this familiarity tends to be disfigured the moment we pull back from our practical immersion and take up a disengaged or Cartesian stance toward the world. But that emphasis on pre-discursive familiarity might arouse some doubts associated, as Bob just noted, with Ernst Tugendhat. What kind of familiarity would that be? Throughout the book, we're told that we must not equate familiarity with intelligibility. On page 10 of the preface, which is to say page X, we're told that we should not submit the domain of meaningful being to the authority of the thinkable or the narrow criterion of knowability. On page 75, we're told that the meaning of being becomes accessible not through discursive thought, but in virtue of an attunement or Stimmung. We must be gripped by something mattering. On page 121, we're again told that the meaningfulness of worldly entities does not require a self-conscious discursive orientation. It requires only being involved in the nexus of practical significance that is constitutive of Dasein's world. On page 135, Pippin tells us that scientific objectivity has only enhanced a distortion into what is, after all, more primordial, the deeper stratum of meaningfulness. The book is replete with such contrasts, and rightly so, since Heidegger's task is structured by a twofold gesture of warning and recommendation. We're warned against the errors of the intellectualist prejudice, and we're enjoined to follow Heidegger as he embarks upon a new path of thinking. Now, in case there's any misunderstanding, let me say as straightforwardly as I can that Pippin's exposition strikes me as exceptionally well argued, and I find myself largely in agreement. But there's a difference here between exposition and critique. So I'd like to move beyond questions of expository accuracy to ask if Pippin might elaborate on his own critical assessment of Heidegger's claims. I'd be especially curious to hear if Pippin agrees with Heidegger's theory of meaning. If I read him correctly, Pippin seems to endorse this theory of meaning. My own reading is perhaps less charitable. The strong contrasts that serve as the infrastructure to the Seinsfrage all direct us to a paradoxical claim, or I find it paradoxical, that Dasein knows more than it can know and thinks more than it can think. Now, there's nothing truly mystical about this, though admittedly it has the aroma of mysticism. It seems that for Heidegger, and perhaps for Pippin, that deeper stratum of meaningfulness lies beyond the reach of the discursive mind. The paradox here, however, is that every time I seek to render this meaningfulness intelligible, I do it in an injustice. I taint it with the rules of logic that have held sway throughout the metaphysical tradition. To escape this paradox, I must slacken the grip of my own conceptual schemes. I must open myself to what Hartmut Rosa calls resonance, my responsiveness to primordial meaning. If I'm not mistaken, Pippin readily embraces this paradox. On page 188, he tells us that we need to reconceive philosophical thinking as something other than discursive rationality. But I'm not certain that this conveys the true strangeness of Heidegger's argument. Let's suppose that we go at least halfway and agree to reject rationality in the narrow sense. Even if this were so, we might still hold fast to a standard of meaning that permits us to say that meaningfulness, after all, must mean something to us. What comes into the horizon of familiarity must be intelligible to us in some way, or we could not say that it has entered our world at all. At times in his book, Pippin seems to admit this point. He writes that, quote, "There is still no sense to the question of the meaning of being except with reference to the being for whom beings for whom things can mean at all. That's at page 188. And I like that statement. But I want to know what it could mean for things to mean at all when they lie behind, beyond our conceptual apparatus. One possible answer to this question is to be found in Heidegger's method of formal indication. All the same, I suspect that the things that we can point to as meaningful using even that method will end up having meanings that would, after all, be intelligible, or they will just not count as meaningful. The question must be, can meaningfulness constitute a meaningful horizon, but resist being available to us as meaning? Pippin raises a similar question at the very end of his book, but he does not provide a definitive answer. On page 217, he asks, is there or is there not a form of non-discursively available meaningfulness in human experience? End quote. My question for Pippin is quite simple. What does he think? For me, the fear that the world will always suffer distortion when it's brought into the horizon of intelligibility is simply one step too many. It verges on a kind of experientialist irrationalism or apophatic theology. And on a related matter, isn't poesis discursive in some sense? What would it mean to deny its discursive character? Is attunement wholly unavailable for articulation? Surely it is in some sense, or the entire existential analytic might founder in performative contradiction. Thirdly, and finally, let me touch for only a moment on Heidegger's cultural politics. I admire this book tremendously, but at this late date, I find it hard to take instruction from Heidegger on matters that pertain to how we should live our lives. The problem can't be confined only to the dismaying and obvious record of his political conduct during the Third Reich. That's only the very surface of the problem, and maybe we could slip free of that particular difficulty. We could follow the esteemed French sociologist Gisèle Sapiro and draw a distinction between author and work. On page 162, there's a telling footnote in which Pippin seems to draw just that distinction. He expresses his vain wish that Heidegger had behaved more admirably. I share that wish. I also wish that in the Black Notebooks he had not said that the errors of the technological age were to be blamed on world Jewry, and I wish he had not blamed the Jews for their own self-annihilation or Selbstvernichtung. Of all the loathsome statements in his work, that may rank among the very worst, since it amounts to blaming the victims for their own deaths. Still, unlike those who, Heidegger and others, supported the Nazi regime, and unlike those who burned books in May 1933, I don't think it's at all useful to burn or even banish philosophical works because their authors were unpleasant. The difficulty, however, goes much deeper. Even when the topic is not explicitly political, Heidegger's written legacy comes to us freighted with cultural commitments that are not easily separable from his philosophy. To any student of German thought, these commitments are well known, and they express an attitude that may itself elude summary. Let me call it provincialism, romanticism, artisanal holism. In his essay Wozu Dichter, from which Pippin quotes on page 212, Heidegger quotes lines by Rilke that betray a similar posture of nostalgia for the well-knit comforts of his grandparents' world with its familiar steeple and its local well. These objects of everyday concern are of infinite value, and they are menaced by the intrusion of ersatz objects introduced from America. This nostalgia may strike us as merely naive or lacking in sociological self-consciousness, but I think it's something worse. It belongs to a genre of high-minded kitsch. Adorno was among the deracinated urban intellectuals who damned Heidegger for this kind of thing, and perhaps with good reason. The difficulty here is that what I'm calling Heidegger's cultural politics can't be easily dismissed, since I think it refers to the very same web of provincial familiarity that we're calling meaningfulness. There's no bright line, in other words, between the cultural provincialism that made Heidegger so anxious about Americanism or Judaism or any foreign encroachments on his quiet Lebenswelt, and the ontological provincialism that structures his philosophy. So I'll conclude with a final question. What if there is a connection between this provincialism of meaning in Heidegger and the persistent bond with idealism I mentioned when I began? If Heidegger is right that the idealist tradition has led us into error, then it would follow that we would be justified in examining Heidegger's philosophy for the idealist patterns that contributed to its own errors. And with this suggestion, Pippin will recognize, I think, that I've just repeated Adorno's verdict. Idealism already prepares the way for domination. I'll borrow a phrase here from Habermas and close by saying that when we read Heidegger today, we must think with Heidegger against Heidegger. And I'd like to hear what Pippin thinks about that proposal. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. Now we move on to our second respondent, Andresa. Floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. So thanks to Dilip for the invitation and to Robert Pippin for writing this rich and rewarding book. In my comments today, I'm going to limit myself to Heidegger's critical engagement with Hegel. And I will first summarize what I took this criticism to be, and then I will raise two broad questions. And just to anticipate, my first question is going to be, is Heidegger's criticism of Hegel external or internal or external, a criticism that Hegel would have to accept given his own commitments, or one that he wouldn't have to accept? And my second question is going to be, aren't there more affinities between Heidegger and Hegel than Heidegger and maybe even Pippin wants to acknowledge? So I'm going to start with the criticism. According to Pippin, Heidegger is right to describe Hegel as the culmination of a tradition that began with the ancients and sort of specifically with Plato. This tradition is characterized by two theses. And the first thesis is that to be is to be intelligible, and as Pippin puts it, ultimately in principle knowable. And the second thesis is that the domain of the knowable exhausts the domain of all possibly meaningful being. For Heidegger, these two theses cannot be pried apart, because a view about what it is to be is in effect also a view about what constitutes the meaning of being, and so in effect, a view that circumscribes possibly meaningful being. And we should think of Hegel as the culmination of this tradition because in his Science of Logic, Hegel presents the concept as self-sufficient and absolute. So Hegel's concept of the concept implies that there can be nothing external to it, and this would make the concept exhaustive of the domain of being and hence of the domain of meaningful being. To put this slightly differently, Hegel is accused of thinking that when we relate to any entity, we relate to it as something knowable, and also as something that is meaningful insofar as it is knowable or because of its knowability. Although Pippin does not always agree with the details of Heidegger's interpretation of Hegel, he agrees with Heidegger's general assessment of Hegel's place and of his limitations. As Pippin puts it in the opening pages of his book, quote, "Neither Kant nor Hegel is in a position to give a defensible, non-dogmatic, non-question begging answer to the question of the Sinn des Seins," unquote. So my first question is Heidegger raising an internal or an external criticism of Hegel? So Heidegger's first criticism concerns Hegel's identification of being and thinking. And according to Pippin's reconstruction, the problem here is that this identification of being and thinking is an unexamined assumption. So Heidegger also thinks that this identity could never be defended or philosophically justified, because it always already presupposes a relationship to the world that it cannot bring within its own purview. So this identity between being and thinking could only ever be dogmatically asserted and never philosophically defended. And here the charge seems to be one of dogmatism. And I think this sounds to me like an internal criticism of Hegel, because Hegel claims that we shouldn't help ourselves to any unexamined assumptions. So if he were assuming the identity of being and thinking, he would be violating his own methodological commitments to a presuppositionless science. So Heidegger's second criticism is that Hegel is implicitly committed to the view that what makes something meaningful is that it is knowable, and relatedly, that the domain of the knowable exhausts the domain of the possibly meaningful. Heidegger's problem with this view is that Hegel's assumption about the meaning of being prevents us from even raising the question about the meaning of being. And this, in effect, courts meaninglessness. So this is a characterization that Pippin provides in his book. And here the charge seems to be one of nihilism. And I'm not sure whether this is supposed to be an internal or an external criticism of Hegel, since Hegel does not frame what he's doing in terms of meaningfulness at all. So I guess my question would be, is the charge of nihilism one that Hegel would have to take seriously on his own terms, given his own project? And I also wanted to suggest a few possible lines of response that might be open to Hegel in his own defense, given the criticisms that I've just presented. So one thing Hegel could say is that the science of logic relies on the results of the phenomenology of spirit, which is supposed to provide an argument for the identification of being and thinking. So even though the science of logic starts with this identification, this is not just a groundless presupposition, but the conclusion of a prior argument, which Hegel provides in the phenomenology of spirit. And if that's true, then Hegel could also give a response that I think is in some ways similar to the one that Pippin grants Kant in the book. So Pippin writes, and this is on page 94, Heidegger is focusing on Kant's treatment of cognition, ultimately scientific cognition of the Newtonian world, and it would not be fair to Kant to insist that he understands this cognitive or judgmental modality as either exclusive or even privileged. It is simply the topic he's writing about in the first critique. So couldn't Hegel also respond that the phenomenology of spirit, which is supposed to provide an argument for the identity of thinking and being, is a work in epistemology, so its focus is going to be on our cognitive relationship to the world. And in that case, the sheer fact that Hegel is focusing on the question of what makes something knowable does not mean that he believes no ability to exhaust the domain of meaningful being. And so this brings me to my second question, which is the following. Are there more affinity between Heidegger and Hegel? Maybe Pippin want to knowledge. And so here I have one specific point of affinity in mind. Pippin emphasizes that Heidegger takes our cognitive relationship to the world to be founded or based on a deep and immediate familiarity with the world that is always already presupposed. And so one characterization he gives of it is on page 55, where Pippin writes, there is some sort of experiential attentiveness to such manifestness, and this attentiveness is preconceptual, and that will form one of the most important points of contrast with the German idealists. So Heidegger's insistence on the priority of this deep and immediate familiarity is supposed to stand in contrast with the picture that we get in Hegel. So according to Heidegger, our most fundamental or foundational relationship to being is to be, as Pippin puts it, immersed in the field of significances. By contrast, figures like Hegel assume that our most fundamental relationship to being is conceptual, reflective, or cognitive. And here I think that these terms are being identified. It seems to me like they're being identified. Conceptual, reflective, and cognitive are treated as continuous with each other. But it seems to me that Hegel places a lot of emphasis on a deep and immediate familiarity with the world. And he also believes it to be presupposed whenever we pluck something from a field of significances and treat it as an object of knowledge in a certain sense or in a certain respect. And here I'm thinking specifically of his argument, again, in the phenomenology of spirit, and less perhaps in the science of logic, though that might be debatable. So Pippin might not disagree with how I have just described Hegel's phenomenology, I think up to a certain point. His presentation of Hegel in this book is very nuanced and subtle, and he hints at various convergences between Hegel and Heidegger throughout that presentation. So for example, Pippin writes, quote, this is on page 50, after all, Hegel relies in the phenomenology on such non-discursive moments of disclosure as the struggle for recognition, which is certainly not an exchange of judgmental claims. But Pippin takes such moments to be rather rare in the book as a whole, and he thinks that for Hegel, they would be ultimately incomplete until reflectively articulated. But to me, it seems that that the phenomenology of spirit as a whole can be read as arguing for the primacy of a deep and immediate familiarity that is not best captured by the picture of a subject standing in a relationship of knowing to an object. So the picture with which he begins the phenomenology that he associates with natural consciousness and that he explores specifically in the chapter on sense certainty. So one reason that I think this is Hegel's comment about animals in the chapter on sense certainty. So in a very famous passage, Hegel says that even animals know better than to stand before objects and merely apprehend them. So in other words, even animals, and I think presumably he means us as well, are immersed in the world and engaged with it in a way that Hegel favorably contrasts with this reflective distance from objects that he associates with sense certainty and the relationship to objects characteristic of sense certainty. And my other reason for thinking this has to do with Hegel's overall argument for the primacy of spirit, which is always already presupposed whenever we adopt any kind of cognitive attitude towards an object. So he takes this reflective relationship that a conscious subject bears to an object of knowledge to be founded on spirit and a kind of abstraction from spirit. So Hegel might have the view that spirit is transparent to itself, whatever that means, but that isn't necessarily, he doesn't necessarily imply that it is going to be transparent to any conscious subject who is immersed in it. So there still might be a sense in which spirit is being presupposed in a way that is not fully transparent to conscious subjects themselves. So I just wanted to sort of make a final suggestion here, which is that even though Heidegger was clearly negatively disposed towards Hegel's project in the phenomenology of spirit, I think he might be overlooking the extent to which this book is phenomenological in a genuine sense. So it's true that Heidegger and Hegel might disagree in how best to characterize this deep and immediate familiarity, but it seems to me like Hegel is also trying to do justice to some kind of unreflective experience of being in the world in a way that is at least parallel to Heidegger's, even if their specific characterizations of it differs. And in that case, Hegel would be doing a lot more than merely bringing one tradition to its culmination or completion. He would also be anticipating and maybe even commencing another tradition that was yet to come. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Andresa. So we're going to our third and final respondent, that is Mark.
Yeah.
Mark, the floor is yours.
I mean, I loved both of the comments, so I hope I don't repeat too much of some of the themes that are in both of them. This is a fantastic book, and I think I was particularly, eager to read it because I've been thinking a lot about just the strange and like widespread consensus in the 20th century that Hegel marks the end of philosophy, and not in the sense he wanted to be, but in some worse sense, where he represents the collapse of philosophy, its discrediting, its exhaustion, and so on. So I've learned like an enormous amount from the culmination, but I'm particularly interested in the claim that Pippin's making in the culmination, or Robert, I'm sorry, I don't know, I was his student way back, and I've never gotten over calling him by his last name, so I apologize for that. But that the thesis that Heidegger's critique of Hegel is in some ways the most far-reaching and the deepest and the most radical. And I want to suggest that there's at least one important respect in which it is not, and in particular, in which the classical pragmatists, who also sometimes saw Hegel as the culmination of traditional rational metaphysics, saw something that Heidegger missed that's of crucial importance. And I won't be able to say much about the pragmatists. I'm mostly just interested in the problem in Heidegger, if the pragmatists are right. And so I'm going to focus as much as I can on just one single issue. So what is the fundamental flaw in traditional Western metaphysics, according to Heidegger or Robert Heidegger? I'm not going to distinguish between them. On Robert's reading, the main target is the assumption that being is intelligibility, and he calls this, borrowing from Daniel Dahlstrom, the logical prejudice. And there's a lot to say about the logical prejudice, but I want to just at least get enough of what he says about Kant and Hegel on board so we can see what exactly is involved in the logical prejudice, at least in those two important cases. For Kant, the assumption that being is intelligibility is most clearly present, it looks to me, in the priority of the categories to experience. And so this is in Kant's claim that there's, and I'm quoting Robert's summary of Kant, that there's no way for any experience to be onto any object without a priori conditions, pure concepts, pure intuitions, and the productive imagination. For Kant, then, like nothing could possibly show up in our experience that didn't satisfy the conditions of intelligibility. And in Hegel, the presence of the logical prejudice is most evident in the systematic priority of the science of logic over his real philosophy, over the philosophy of nature and spirit. And here it takes on, as he said in his summary, a more metaphysical character. So the science of logic establishes what's categorically necessary for being to be a determinate being at all. And then in the rest of the system, Hegel, and there's different versions of this, he derives or unfolds or does something similar to that, the various determinate shapes that this can take in nature and in spirit. And there are like lots of debates about how to understand these claims in Hegel and also in Kant. But I think Robert shows that these differences don't really turn out to matter much for Heidegger's critique. It's deep enough that it's going to hit even the most sophisticated versions of Hegel. So despite their differences, though, Kant and Hegel thus share the idea that nothing could exist in experience or in reality that didn't satisfy the conditions of intelligibility, and that the conditions of intelligibility can be articulated to some degree independently of experience by pure reason. I mean, there's qualifications you have to make about what kind of independence we're talking about. From Heidegger's point of view, as Robert describes it, I think there's something that's definitely going wrong here, and there's something that's definitely going right here. And I think that the commentators have both emphasized that there's more of a continuity between Heidegger and the idealist or there's a surprising continuity that's worth sort of bringing out, as well as the difference. So the difference is the one that Robert's focusing on, which it has to do with the logical prejudice, and that's that they take for granted an answer to the question of the meaning of being, and that presupposition is that being must be intelligible. But the thing that I think Robert and Heidegger think that the idealists were getting right, the thing that makes them like spiritually great, is something that I want to call, I'm borrowing this a little bit from Rorty, but I don't want to take on board too much of the connotations of doing such a thing. I want to call it the philosophical prejudice. And the philosophical prejudice is an insistence on the priority of some kind of empirically unaided thinking over the objects of experience or over beings. So despite the deep disagreements with the German idealists, Heidegger's enterprise seems to fully retain the idea that thinking, or philosophic thinking sometimes, is pure and autonomous, that it's not dependent on any empirical warrant, and thus it has some kind of unilateral priority over what we encounter in our experience, although it's never available independently of that experience, as Robert said also in his opening remarks. So philosophic thinking determines how or in what manner the specific beings we encounter show up. Now, it seems to me that this book just fully embraces that commitment or endorses that commitment in Heidegger, and it seems consistent with Robert's ultimate position, or what I take to be Robert's position. The ultimate view that I liked this part because I think it makes it very clear how the priority of thinking, the role the priority of thinking plays in Heidegger's account. That Robert gives us a picture where there's these three tiers, and at the bottom tier is like what we take beings to be in some particular historical world. And that depends on what he calls a regime of mattering, where there's some answer to the question of what the meaning of being is. And that depends at the deepest level on the history of being, or this clearing and lighting process, to use the more Heideggerian jargon. And so it follows, I think, from this basic three-tier picture, that the thing that's ultimately supposed to explain everything else, at least in their important philosophic respects, is the history of being, so the top tier, and that this cannot be explained by anything that shows up on the lower tier. So it can't be explained by scientific developments, economic transformations, political revolutions, artistic transformations, genealogies, new technology, but eventually, so any appeal to like an ordinary explanation, an ordinary or scientific fact or historical fact to explain why we've moved from one way of thinking about being to another would, I think, and this is a term that comes up a lot in the book, it would be question begging, since the very availability of the fact presupposes a particular answer to the question of being. So that relies on that priority of thinking claim. And I know I'm not the only one who thinks this, and I can't justify that, I can't refute Heidegger on this, but this just seems like Heidegger's painted himself into a really tight corner. so he makes it so that literally every first order question about beings or what being might be depends on the history of being. But the history of being is like necessarily inexplicable in any ordinary sense. So then you had the fate and mittance and all of the Heidegger, like the very difficult stuff in the late Heidegger. You're just forced into that because there's just no way you're going to explain what's happening with, like, in terms of any normal genealogy or history or anything like that. So what I want to suggest is it just seems to me that when you reject the logical prejudice, but you retain the priority of philosophy prejudice, then you're led to this like very unattractive dead end. And this suggests to me that like the two stable positions are like either giving up both the logical prejudice and the philosophic prejudice, or potentially going back to German idealism, which I had, as I said, my very famous advisor at the University of Chicago was once known for that position back in the 2000s. And so I want to just ask why Robert thinks Heidegger is right to keep the philosophical prejudice. So I think one line of thought in the culmination is that philosophy just is empirically unaided thought about being. And so if you get rid of the idea that there's a form of thinking that's not answerable to experience, you're getting rid of philosophy itself. And he sometimes suggests that all you're going to have left then is some kind of, it's either like positivism plus conceptual analysis, or you're going to have like a kind of hermeneutics of suspicion where the pretensions of thinking are undercut once you actually understand like the role it plays in, I mean, it depends on if you're a Marxist or a Nietzschean, what you take the ultimate account to be. And if this is Robert's answer, I just think it's not a fair way of posing the options. So the pragmatists offer a different way of coming to grips with German idealism, which leads to an importantly different conception of philosophy, one that I don't think lapses into either of the alternatives Robert is worried about. So the single most important pragmatist claim about the history of philosophy, at least as I understand it, and I think this is in James, but it's really clear in Dewey, is that German idealism should be regarded as a reaction to a form of empiricism that was committed to a profoundly inadequate sensationalist conception of experience. Experience is non-conceptual. And the pragmatists thought that if you just fix the inadequate conception of experience that you see in Hume and before Hume, and you replace it with a better conception in which experience includes concepts and relations in James's case, then the idealist recoil from classical empiricism starts to look unmotivated. And once you have this appropriately widened or radical view of experience, you just don't need to think that there's a kind of thinking that's prior to experience in the specific sense of determining the forms that beings in our experience take, whether you understand that more Kantian way, a more Hegelian way, or a more Heideggerian way. So everything is then going to be on a level. So, and for William James, this meant that German idealism was an unnecessary digression in the history of thought. So he wasn't very sympathetic to German idealism for this reason. And so he thought we just needed to outflank Kant and Hegel, the way he put it. Dewey had a more Hegelian temperament. And so he thought that what it showed is that the continental rationalist tradition and the English classical empiricist tradition, they shared a fatal premise, a mistaken view of experience, and they needed to be sublated by a third alternative. But in both cases, they were packaging what I take to be the same basic thought, is that we just need a concept of experience that doesn't itself force us to think that there's a form of thinking that's entirely independent of experience and determining it in some way. And I'm sure that Robert must think this is wrong, because I'm sure he's incredibly familiar with this position that I'm laying out, which is like was endorsed by lots of people in the 20th century and is probably more common in Anglo-American contexts than the alternative. And so I just want to say, like, I'm wondering if he can, I totally learned so much from this book from Heidegger, and I can see that he has things that this pragmatist line of thought doesn't have. And I have said nothing about it because I have 12 minutes and can't go over 12 minutes about all the things I've learned from the book. But the thing I think, it just feels to me that the pragmatists were right or potentially right about this, or at the very least, Robert hasn't given a positive defense of why we would need to retain the philosophical prejudice, which is what establishes Heidegger's continuity with Kant and Hegel and potentially makes him, as Peter was saying in his comments, like maybe he's really the end of traditional bad metaphysics. And I want to know, I guess I just want to hear more from Robert about why he is not attracted to the pragmatist alternative to Heidegger. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. Robert, you got a lot on your plate.
Boy, I'll say, Yeah, I don't really know how to do that. I've taken a lot of notes, so I'm going to think about all this for a long time. This is really very, very striking, helpful, provocative. I'm really in everyone's debt, and I'm not going to be able to do justice to the remarks. Let me start with Peter and the 3 points. Idealism. Given that for Heidegger, the priority, the fundamentality, the primordiality of the availability of anything is this matter of the disclosing of meaning. It's naturally going to be the case that he also includes as a constituent element of experience the uniqueness of the only being for whom things can mean. So you can call that idealism to a certain extent, but it has 2 fundamental differences with the German idealist conception of idealism. One is that it has nothing to do with one very common interpretation of Kant, that the structure of the subject without which experience would not be at all intelligible is constitutive of experience by virtue of a kind of impositionism. Material from the sensible world is displayed in our intuitive access to the world, and then it's conceptualized actively in a way that means the world is only experienced within the limits of the conceivable by a finite human subject. So idealism in that sense is a Restriktionslehre, as the Germans say. It's a restriction doctrine, that we don't know things other than how we are so situated. And intuition, the space-time intuitions are simply, in some sense or other, a finitely empirical fact about the human subject, that we have only these ways of the world becoming available to us. So idealism in the sense of a restriction is not, or an impositionism or a restriction doctrine. Here Heidegger does agree with Hegel. Like as in the original reaction of Fichte, it makes no sense that beings are only available in their knowability, and then say that somehow their being available in their knowability is a restriction. How else are they supposed to be available other than in their knowability? So the Hegelian Fichtean point that the doctrine of the thing in itself is irrelevant, and the identity of thinking and being, while a speculative identity, is quite possible without the restriction of Kant. Now, does that make Heidegger a kind of Hegelian idealist? And here I say no, because the centrality in Hegel is the self-animating nature of pure thinking. And just to say it in a really kind of direct way, for Heidegger, meaning is not in any way implicated in the spontaneous activity of the inner animation of pure thought in Hegel. It isn't connected to that. Those conceptualizable, those conceiving conditions constituted for being, as they are for thinking, aren't revelatory for the problem of meaning, because meaning isn't a result. It happens to us. We're open to it. So this notion of Dasein's centrality as indicating an idealist premise has to deal with the fact that Dasein is, as later Heidegger makes clear, a kind of sight, not an active thinking subject. So it's a very, very, and you could call it idealist, I guess, because there's still the central, but Dasein is not a thing, not a subject. It is pure possibility. There's just all sorts of differences that make anything like the impositionism or restriction doctrine, or even the Hegelian absoluteness of pure thinking, impossible for Heidegger to accept. So this central question of meaning as disclosed in a sight, this is going to get to Peter's 3rd point about what it could mean to say this if we're so excluding the role of the conceptual articulability of this meaning. But as he says in his Hegel and the Greek book, yeah, it's true that Dasein is always that to whom things can mean, but Dasein doesn't have to be a subject. And I think he means in the same sense to say meaning is not the product of the spontaneity of thought, but is this, much more to say about this, but now that's raised his second problem. Let me go right to the heart of the matter. Does he leave us with, unfortunately, in the Heidegger literature of the last 20 or 30 years, the temptation to kind of Vatic and oracular prose has proven irresistible, especially as Heidegger, after the enormously important influence of people like Taylor and Dreyfus, was then taken over by the theologians and the whole enterprise of negative theology. This kind of proto-prophetic discursive invocation of Heidegger has, I think, gotten a little out of hand. But the one thing I want to say in response to Peter is the inability for discursive translation of what we find disclosed in what happens to matter to us is really not that unusual a feature of common human life. I mean, we often find that things matter to us that we actually think shouldn't matter. They just happen to matter. And we think they shouldn't, but even after thinking we shouldn't, they do. And various things that don't matter to us, we think should matter, and they don't. I mean, you can think I ought to be a kind of person that likes opera, and you can go to a lot of operas, and you can sort of learn a lot about it. But I find, it finally doesn't matter to me. So the contingency and passivity and dependence issue is, I think, all requiring much more commentary. I think all the basic things one has to stress in response to Peter on idealism and the question of meaning. When we engage in our attempt to understand how things matter to us in ordinary life, we don't have available to us any kind of discursive resolution of it. What did it matter? What did he mean when he said that to me? Why did he say that to me? What did he mean that he said? What does it, and I asked somebody, what does it mean to you that you're estranged from your children? What does it mean to you that all your friends died in the war? We don't expect a discursive proposition. Mostly we expect a kind of narrative. And, we know it's not dispositive about what it means. It's an invitation to many other kinds of formulations of this narrative. But that gets to, I think, what's the central problem in the issue Peter raised: truth. Truth. It doesn't seem like we can go any further with this notion of the disclosure of meaning if there can't be a distinction we can get some grip on between being right about it mattering this way or being wrong. I mean, you don't have to be Tugendhat and look for translation and paraphrase. That's got to be something we have some kind of grip on, or Heidegger is leading us down the path to just complete indeterminacy and unkontrollierte Auffassung and all the rest. There's got to be. I think there is, though, and again, I would appeal both to the way in which we do make some progress by circling around an issue in conversation. What did you mean? What were you trying to say? Without a formulation that settles the matter. And my example would be teaching literature and film, in which we don't try to give paraphrase. My example is the Shakespeare sonnet, which starts, "My love is nothing like the sun." Student asks, "What does that mean?" You say, "My love is not very pretty, but she's all right with me." You're not doing a very good job as a teacher. What you want to do is try to say things that, it is a kind of pointing that will encourage the student to re-experience the poem in a deeper way. None of that can be formulated, as Gadamer kept pointing out, in a method. There is no method to that. It's a different kind of activity. But I do think we sense, as in a film, we sense when a presentation is not credible and when it is credible, but we can't say why. But we're stuck with that. The central feature of human life that we shouldn't try to force into experimental psychology or some other form of, even in psychoanalytic terms, let's say. Now, ontological provincialism. Well, Heidegger wrote this book within an atmosphere of an enormous crisis of meaning. I yield to no one in my disgust with Heidegger's the black books, with the political activity, with all of that. But if the claim is he's given us no way of rejecting that he's locked us in a kind of mystical cloud, typical of the Black Forest or something. I wouldn't agree with that. I do think we actually exist in a similar kind of crisis situation. Once the American second industrial revolution began to peter out in the 1970s, and the enormous economic boom of the post-war years from 75 to the mid-70s began to deteriorate, and growth started to slow, and income inequality started to grow, and universities stopped being funded by the state. And once that started in 2008 happened, it made it clear that there was a crisis, not just in capitalism, but a crisis in senselessness in ordinary life. Opioid addiction, unstable family situations, a kind of dishonorable indifference to the suffering of others in our community. There's now an unbelievable political catastrophe with an authoritarian government and a secret police and things that we would have never assumed imaginable. Why we are experiencing this crisis seems to me not directly a result, and going to something Mark said, not really available to ideology critique. The level of disaffection with the form of life we've created, whether acknowledged as not by the people who are miserable, is way beyond what the cycles of growth and collapse in capitalism are, or the colonization of the life world, or all of those things have at bottom a sense of a crisis of meaning that I think we ought to use Heidegger to try to get ourselves back into some way of thinking about, without buying Heidegger's history of being as it's been written, or without buying the implications he drew from it. Well, moving on to Andreas, whether this is internal or external, I worry about this myself. I mean, one way of stating what you're suggesting is, why is Heidegger asking Hegel the question that's not his question? Doesn't a philosopher have the right to define a question and then approach it? And of course, Heidegger would say this can't be solved by giving Hegel a regional ontology. If you want to know something about the basic problem of the knowability of being, you want to work on that, fine. I'm just going to work on this experiential problem of meaning over here that you touch on in the phenomenology. But even in the struggle for recognition, the experiential disclosure about the problem of status that occurs, it only becomes stabilized in human life in stoicism, in skepticism, in the unhappy consciousness. It's not an original source of meaningfulness. It's a provocation to attempts at making it meaningful by a kind of discursive philosophy. So Heidegger would think, well, in the first place, there isn't the same depth experiential attentiveness in Hegel that I'm looking for, because it always is preliminary to a rational recovery of the traces of reason that are developing in this science of the experience of consciousness. So we don't really have a phenomenological account of the experience of consciousness. We have a science of consciousness, to use the alternate title of the phenomenology. And of course, I also have to mention, I mean, I'm sure you would disagree with this, but Hegel's point about the phenomenology is that the phenomenology doesn't lead us to the logic. It already presupposes that the absolute, as he says, is presupposed. I mean, the way in which all of Hegel works is the idea that the kind of putative failure of various modes or models of the subject's relation to the world in trying to articulate themselves is not just a matter of a kind of skeptically successful collapsing of one such model. It has an implication that has a logos. But that's only true, as all teleological accounts are, if something like the end is already fixed at the beginning. Otherwise, there can't be determinate negation. P are Q, but not both, not P, therefore Q. means you've already got P or Q. You started out with, you see what I mean? So the Hegelian attempt to develop a position like this, and this actually is, I think, a deep point that for all Hegelians should be a credible point. Is it really possible anymore, especially to conceive of the work of reason in history in Hegel? Not the details of his philosophy of history, but given that Hegel thought in the philosophy of objective spirit, we've arrived at, basically in its inception, potentially a form of rational ethical life. And it turns out that wasn't true. That the form of ethical life we live in is permeated by grotesque irrationality, even on the Hegelian conception of rationality. Then what are the implications of that for somebody who's trying to reconstruct the basic Hegelian way of looking at the world? Since this notion of the dialectical transformation of reason is so important to it. However, to just express my own worry about this, you could ask, well, how much of Hegel's not being concerned with the question of, at least Heidegger's version of the question of the meaningfulness of being, contaminates the rest of his philosophy? How much of that contaminates the rest of it? Isn't it still quite interesting what Hegel says about the mind-world relation, the development, the importance of second nature in our understanding of ethical life, the role of Bildung, his conception of art as a collective expression of self-knowledge at a time? How much of all of that is compromised in some way by the fact that Hegel hasn't really addressed the question of the original availability of Bedeutsamkeit, or significance in life? I'm not really sure. I think, but the Hegelian point of view is it contaminates all of it, because all of it presupposes a kind of root notion of the availability of meaningfulness, fundamentally in terms of the problem of freedom, but in terms of the question of cognizability, we find ourselves unfree if we are without a self-conscious understanding of our intelligible relation with the world. That's another manifestation of unfreedom. That's why it's painful. That's why it means something, matters something to us, because of its instability and the homelessness it creates in our relation to the world. But I think Heidegger would try to say you've got off on the wrong foot if you're looking there for the emergence of Bedeutsamkeit, or the significance of things in their availability. The idea that their availability is immediately keyed to their intelligibility is dogmatic. Well, I don't want to talk too long. Let me say something about what Mark was on to. Given first that there's no way to explain the history of being. What do we make of the history of being? Since for Heidegger, for there to be any concrete implication of Heidegger, he's got to be roughly right about the transition from early modern philosophy to the technological age. He's certainly right and prescient in talking about the way all aspects of meaning in daily life, for example, medical treatment, how we experience illness, how we are all sort of so suffused with technological imperatives that the very meaningfulness of everyday experience seems saturated in a way that is subjectivist, impositionist, manipulative, and is partly responsible for the devastation of the earth. The idea that he can give some, I don't find very sympathetic the idea that we really understand what happened with the inauguration of the Platonic revolution, the Greek Enlightenment. But Heidegger does have, at various points in his writing, a kind of quasi-existentialist account of the self-assertiveness of human being in an attempt at mastery. It goes back to the notion of a kind of original anxiety that needs to be addressed. So Platonism and the original doctrine of being as idea, which starts all this off, represents a kind of refusal to accept our situation, the finitude of our situation, and the lack of control we have over the domain of the historical world as a source of meaningfulness, and to assert a kind of control over what we don't have control over by understanding being as intelligibility. Well, does Heidegger keep a philosophical prejudice? Well, Yeah, you could say that, but the idea of a radical transformation of philosophy, so that, what we're trying to figure out is what's happening to us as a task of interpretation without relying on, kind of presuppositions about social science or, what it can tell us, that we need another way of thinking about it, means we're not going to do philosophy in the traditional way. We're still, writing and thinking, but the whole concept of thinking now broadens to include, say, poetry as a form of philosophical thought, not as a provocation for philosophy, but something we can learn from as philosophy. Same thing with film. And there, yeah, at some level, ideology critique and a kind of exposure is quite possible, because it's true to say sometimes we believe things we don't know we believe. And the famous phrase by Bernard Williams, there's a difference between what we think and what we really think. And in Heidegger, there's a difference between what we think we experience and what we really experience that is as paradoxical as all the rest of those. But I think I'll close with this, the problem with, and I know you don't have time to say what you mean by pragmatism, but the claim that we should just abandon this philosophically self-reflective, however transformed it is, and think of how, various problems come up in our experience that we need to solve. Ultimately, for Heidegger, discursability is always possible. If we're engaged in a project and the tool breaks down, we can say what happens, but that doesn't get to the level of its original manifestability as meaningful. So that's not a pragmatist kind of approach, that the world shows up in terms of our tasks, because that's only one domain of the way in which the enterprises of Dasein are influenced by and attentive to various aspects of the world, without Dasein, they wouldn't be available. But the whole central problem for Heideggerian with pragmatism is, do we really understand what emerges as a problem? What a problem means to us, and what saliences of significance emerge in the problems we take to be important and the problems we don't take to be important. Rorty and other pragmatists like him, like Dewey, just assume that that's really just not very interesting a question. People are starving, the bridge has to be built, all of that just becomes, that's not true. What we take to emerge as salient, as a problem to be addressed, is already the provocation for philosophy, because it could be, as you point out, it could be a result of, say, the interests of those who are in the control or steering of the social direction of a society. So the interpretive moment and the assessing moment with respect to the problem of general meaningfulness still seems to be relevant and not avoidable by the pragmatists. Just, whatever needs to be done, let's do it. Well, what needs to be done? Oh, I'm going on too long, so I'll stop. But I'm deeply grateful for all of that. Really was extraordinary for me.
Thank you, Robert. Peter, Andreja, Mark, do you want to make some comments before? Vidura, do you have any questions, people?
No one's raised a hand or sent me a message.
Okay.
So, but I think if you kind of point that out, people will start doing it.
Let's have a quick response by Peter, Andreja, and Mark, if you have some. Peter?
Just 1 second. There we go.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you, Bob. This was fascinating. I really liked the other comments and your responses. I'll just ask one question, which maybe foregrounds some of my doubts here. It seems to me that Heidegger may be operating here with a needlessly narrow conception of rationality. Everything that we might think happens in a psychoanalytic session, say when we are alerted to meanings of which we were previously unaware, or everything that might happen in a seminar on poetry or on music or on art, when we try to tease out meanings in conversation with others, strikes me as having a rational character, a normative character. We have a sense of what's the right interpretive direction to go and what's the wrong interpretive direction to go. All of that is discursively available. And we think there's some important rational work that's being done. To me, it doesn't quite make sense to say that that isn't rational work. I think that the structure of interpretation, even in aesthetic claims or in claims of psychoanalysis, the structure of that interpretive practice is broadly speaking rational. And maybe that's because I just have a very quotidian sense of how expansive rational practice is. But I'm interested in your views on that.
Andresa?
Yeah, maybe just really quickly, some of the things that you said towards the end of your response, again, sort of rang Hegelian bells for me. So when you said that there's a difference between what we think we experience and what we really experience, and also the characterization that you give in the book of Heidegger's view that what is most familiar is in some ways furthest away or hardest to capture. I think these are also Hegelian moves. So, I mean, I was just trying to bring up this kind of analogy in their projects, but I think you're right in that in the end, Hegel wants these immediate experiences to be discursively articulated. And I guess there I would say along the lines of what Peter just suggested, that maybe a sufficiently broad understanding of what that discursive articulation would be wouldn't make this such a problematic position, especially if we don't think of philosophical positions as the best expression of those immediate experiences.
Mark?
That was great. I want to respond quickly just in case other people want to say things. This might sound like an indirect way of responding, but I feel like there's two different ways you make use of Heidegger in this book. One way seems to me like richer and more pluralistic and exciting, which is just that there's just so many things in our life that the assumption that being is intelligibility blocks off to us, like relationships, art, etc. And so there, the position just seems to be like life is just so much richer in its significance to us than the kind than like Hegelianism, etc., is going to make sense of. And then the other one is this, I'll put it in my own terms, like a kind of melodramatic Heideggerianism, where we're all sort of locked into the technological, like to a certain dispensation of being that is leading to catastrophe. And those seem to me like, I feel like I'm more attracted to the first and not to the second, and I don't quite know how they get put together in your account.
Robert, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I'll be very quick. I agree with Peter that there's a normative dimension to interpretation and interpretability. I'm not quite sure about the role of reason. We have to say things that are persuasive, but in trying to get to somebody to see what something means, there's a way of encouraging them to have a certain kind of experience. I mean, one of the implications of this is sort of the light bulb issue when you're teaching. You're talking about a philosopher, you're saying a variety of things. Nothing you say really, you can see in the faces of your students, is making it helpful. And then you say something you thought was just trivial, and all of a sudden you see all these light bulbs going off in their head. That's a moment of disclosure and understanding that isn't, you got to believe this because I have good reasons for thinking this interpretation is right. I mean, I do point to the text, and I do try to not have text-free interpretation and to keep pointing to the text and everything else. But in terms of understanding its meaning, there is a kind of invitation to a co-experiencing of the text, and just using that as an example, in a classroom that doesn't seem to be driven by reason giving or by the notion of explicability by reason. I mean, the line that keeps going through my head recently is the end of Lowell's poem, The Union Dead. A savage servility slides by on Greece, which is kind of perfect for the modern age of what people are doing with Trump. Savage servility slides by on Greece. If I try to understand what's being appealed to there, I start talking about a lot of things about servility, why it should be savage, what the grossness of using the word Greece it is doing in the poem and everything else like that. But I'm not going to get anywhere until somebody gets it. And I think that the phenomenon of getting it in that sense is so fundamental in understanding another, or in understanding a film, or in understanding aspects of human life, that I would agree it's normative. There is a right and wrong, but getting to it isn't driven methodologically. And I think of reason as requiring some sort of methodological structure to be really reason. You're certainly right, Andrea, about this, the resonances. I didn't emphasize that enough in the book. I should say the thing that always attracted me to Hegel, and still does, was that he was the first philosopher to try to give philosophy a historically diagnostic task. What philosophy should do is to try to help us understand this life, not that one, not the transcendent, the ideal, but philosophy is its time comprehended in thought. And Hegel was a genius in inventing a kind of way of doing that wasn't empirical or in the traditional sense, moral, ethical, kind of, telling the world how it ought to be. So there's a moment in Hegel that is just as fantastically historically significant as, and I admire still greatly. And Heidegger is a kind of competitor on the issue of the right diagnosis. Hegel's is the incompletion of the conatus of reason in the realization of freedom. That's his diagnosis of any age. It's incomplete realization of freedom because of the incomplete reality of reason, understood as Hegel does, not as Weber does or somebody like that. I don't think that's completely negated by Heidegger. There's a lot to think about with respect to that issue in the modern world. But there's something, I think, at least Heidegger awoke me to something deeper, I think. And Marx's two uses of Heidegger showing us how the logical prejudice blocks us from appreciating other dimensions in human. First of all, I don't think that's unconnected to the second issue you raised about just how bad a shape we're in. The answer to the first one depends on how much is being blocked off. And if you think of what's going on in the teaching of the humanities in universities and in philosophy and so forth, I would say there's an enormous amount being blocked off, not considered credible, not considered authoritative, worth working on, worth thinking about, and so forth. That is responsible for the catastrophe where suffering is. One can't have one without the other. There's just too much that, I mean, if we turn over aesthetics to neuroaesthetics, if we turn over literature to evolutionary theory, if we turn over all interpretation to cultural studies, if we, it's starting to sound like the grandfather I am, but we're in a lot more trouble than being able to make selective use of Heidegger just to say, let's not block off so much. Well, we already have, and we don't seem to understand how to get out of it as we keep going further and further down the line of the danger that Heidegger mentioned. But I'll stop there.
Okay, Vidra, we have any questions?
No, I haven't received any questions, Dilip.
Okay, this is as I said, our 20th episode and the first one directly on philosophy. So I didn't want this to be a conversation between just four philosophers. And let's see if there's anybody else has something to say, especially Heidegger belongs to more than to philosophy. Okay. Well, yeah.
We have a raise.
Okay.
Antoine, could you just ask your question?
Yeah. Thank you all. It's a philosophy question though, so I'm sorry.
That's okay.
But it is a philosophy question though. I want to go back to a point that was raised by Peter Gordon about how attunements must be in some sense discursively articulable. Otherwise, if I recall the point, otherwise there would be something self-defeating or contradictory in the actual laying out of a fundamental ontology. I take it that you were referring especially to the writings of the 90s around of the 20s around being in time, and I suppose that we could say, I mean, I don't know, exactly what Robert would say, but it seems like late Heidegger is very sensitive to the problem of writing in a way that would defy discursivity or discursive articulability. But it seems to be indeed a problem in the 1920s. There's something extraordinarily discursive about being in time that kind of doesn't quite fit the picture of, or at least the picture of an interpretation of Heidegger where attuned disclosure is really the fundamental issue. So if Professor Pippin wants to say something about that, and maybe Peter Gordon could come back to it as well, I'd be grateful.
Well, yeah, it's certainly true that Being in Time is a technically difficult book with written in discursive prose. But it is really still a phenomenological book. And I agree with the recent books by Thomas Sheehan that the best way of understanding Heidegger is to think of phenomenology as surviving through all the various transformations in his philosophical language. But I don't think the point of Being in Time is to translate some kind of meaningfulness into discursive prose. It doesn't do that. It's about doing that. It doesn't do it, but it sets out what must be done by talking about what failure is in doing it. And I don't see that, and in my own case, I don't see there's any contradiction between a highly articulate framework for pointing us to something that doesn't have a kind of articulate redemption.
Thank you.
I'd like to hear from others. I don't need to comment further.
There's another question. Sundar? There's another question if you want to call on.
Yeah, I'm actually, I have a question in the, I think he put it in the chat.
Oh,
Do you want me to read it out?
Yeah, I'd appreciate if you did that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm coming from a completely external perspective to the framework of the discussion just now. It's because my interest is in Indian philosophy and Indian religion, in fact, Eastern philosophies and religions. So the question is, Indian philosophy in quotes, despite its important rational and logical components, and it's a very strong development of logic and reason, etc., within this Indian thought, has been dismissed generally by Western thinkers, including Derrida, as being too tied up with spirituality and spiritual disciplines. That is, with the question of being with a capital B or true being, of existence, etc., where thought is sort of relativized. So I'm just wondering, does Heidegger's critique of Hegel and thereby of Western philosophy as a whole, does it sort of open the door? Could it open the door to a re-evaluation of Indian and Eastern philosophy, which has usually been used, stated, within quotes, as if it's not real philosophy?
Okay. Can I just, there's another question. So can I just call on Prashanjit Bishwad as well? Prashanjit, can you unmute yourself and ask a question? So, we're short on time, so it would be good if we could take that too.
Yes, I wanted to raise a question about the nature of rationality. That for Heidegger, rationality is often conflated with historicity, while the experiential dimension of rationality is all about perceiving, understanding, interpreting, forehaving, foreclosure. And therefore, it doesn't follow a particular framework of logic or a way of validating what one has understood. Therefore, there is a certain amount of indeterminacy of understanding, and this indeterminacy constitutes the meaning of being, or in late Heidegger, being, B-E-Y-N-G. So we see a shift, a kind of a turn occur in Heidegger, based on which Heidegger is actually critiquing Hegel's way of sublation, Hegel's way of creating a sense of the sublime and that which is undisclosed. So therefore, I see an important interface that goes missing in our idea of meaning. Meaning is not completely determinable by rationality. I would like to hear anyone who would like to take this question, especially from Professor Pippin, who is probably trying to find some amount of determination in the experience of indeterminacy, which is part of our modern rational way of life. That's it.
Prathama, I see your comment in the. Do you want me to read it out or? So Prathama Banerjee has a comment in the chat, and she's wondering about the return of ordinary language philosophy today, Wittgenstein and Cavell, in terms of large language models in AI, which is not about meaning but usage. Thinking of Toril Moy, and she's put a link here, beyond the discursive and yet not. So you could take any one of those questions and respond to them. You know, we have another maybe 5 minutes or so. So that would be great.
Well, just on the last point, I actually reviewed Toril's book and I liked it. And it makes contact with a kind of Heideggerian element in Stanley Cavell or John Austin. The return to ordinary language as a mode of access to a kind of meaningfulness that isn't available in traditional analytic prose. And it does have a Heideggerian resonance if you think of the work of Cavell on the modern world, you know, in the books on Thoreau and Emerson and so forth. So I do see a kind of similarity there with that enterprise. I'm not sure we get very far by limiting ourselves to the analysis of ordinary language, but it does have the same kind of resonance. Heidegger himself, going back to the first question, was very interested at the end of his life, the last decade or so, in Eastern philosophy, mostly Japanese philosophy. Wrote a dialogue between him and a Japanese philosopher. I think he made himself a little more knowledgeable about Buddhism than he did about Indian philosophy or the Indian tradition of philosophy. So that doesn't appear, as far as I'm aware, anywhere in his books. It does in Nietzsche, somewhat oddly, since he did know something about it. But if you mean, is the door open to other ways of thinking about the problems that philosophy has traditionally faced? Yes, I think Heidegger is opening that door. The trouble is, invitations to think about that usually invite a kind of unavoidable superficiality. The Indian tradition is quite long, quite complicated, and involves very difficult language. And I don't particularly like very much the idea of dipping into it to get something that would help or illuminate, or it strikes me as a decades-long task to make oneself informed enough to even begin to answer your question. On the issue of rationality, I don't quite know what to say to add to what's been said before. You know, that Heidegger doesn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. He's perfectly happy with there being science and reasons given in ethics and so forth. It's just, again, what he thinks that blocks off, to use Mark's helpful phrase.
Philip, there's one more question in the chat. I'll just read it out. If you have time, maybe, you know, any of you could take it. To what degree, and this is a question by Alan Feldman, to what degree the availability of meaningness is modified by Sherman's reading of action in Heidegger as anarchic, as lacking ground? Further, what is the role of epochal closure in the withdrawal of meaning availability?
Well, that question involves understanding Reiner's last book, especially. I knew Sherman and admired him very much, and I like this idea of the anarchic in Heidegger. I will say it seems to me the best, most accessible way of understanding what he's getting at is the kind of contingency of mattering. another way of talking about its groundlessness. The things that emerge as mattering in an individual life and in a culture as a whole don't have any way of being sustained by a discourse about why they ought to matter. That's essentially what he means by the anarchic. And we have closed off an appreciation of that in a way that makes even the acknowledgement of our finitude in that respect impossible, much less the question of what would be the kind of life appropriate to bearing the burden of that contingency. That suddenly everything that seemed to matter can just stop mattering. The kind of fundamental problem Heidegger first talks about with angst, anxiety, and being in time.
Philippe, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Because okay, thank you so much for participating in this extraordinary session. It's the 20th session, so it's a significant one. So thank you, Professor Pippin, and thank you, Professor Gordon, thank you, Professor Nokovic, and thank you, Mark. And I call him by first person because he's my colleague. And it has been an extraordinary 2 hours. And what you can see is so many of almost 60% of our people are still here, so which is a very good record. Thank you so much for participating in this session, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you, all of
everybody.
you.
Thank you.